Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for delayed opening. Wow.
It's pretty.
Wow.
That's incredible.
We had some technical glitches going on around here, but happy to be here. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start with introduction. We are changing a little flow on the fly because of delays. So I'll introduce Sapna, who's going to be joining me today. We are going to be talking about a topic which is near and dear to us on sustainability. But then we are bringing two sides of sustainability. And that is what we'll talk. I'll let Sapna introduce herself.
No, thank you, Tej, and thank you everyone for being here. And I hope you all are having a great reInvent. My name is Sapna Sardana. I'm a managing director in Barclays. I am the CIO for the planning and stress testing platforms within Barclays, which are making various regulatory submissions to our regulators globally, the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the PRA in UK, the Bank of England, the ECB, etc. And for last number of years, I have also led the climate change program for the bank from the technology and data perspective. So we have stood up an infrastructure which is scalable and try to solve some of the challenges from the sustainability and data perspective. And my teams are right now right in the middle of making some critical ESG regulatory submissions to the regulators.
Thank you, Sapna. And I'm Tej Vakta. Been with Cap for 13 plus years in different roles. In my current role, what I do is I passionately feel about sustainability. So I lead sustainability solutions for financial services as part of Insights and Data, as well as financial services SBU. I came from industry, spent a number of years at Wall Street, working at Merrill Lynch and a few other banks. What I do at Capgemini is I partner with CXOs and banks and insurers and investment managers to bring sustainability, integrate sustainability as part of their way of working, rather than just focusing on net zero decarbonization. How do you bring sustainability similar to what we used to see digital in future? So with that, let's start with a short video, and then we'll get into the topic.
Crisis, turbulence, disruption, social unrest, inequality, natural disasters. We have seen the signs and we listened. Transformation, change, challenge. Today, companies can prosper while committing to ESG. Business leaders are leading and committing to this change. Every ESG journey starts with the commitment to act, and the right data is key to measure, improve, and anticipate and adjust the climate action plan. ESG opportunities exist in every industry. If being socially responsible is your vision, sustainability is at our core.
So the topic today is where we're going to talk about black swan. And again, some of you would know, but I'll introduce the topic, and then green swan solutions. So what are black swans? This is something we've heard talked about. These are rare, unexpected, and extreme events. They come by surprise to us. They bring major disruptions. They are not predictable, but at times we can rationalize them after the fact. So if you take an example, what are the examples of these events? We went through a couple of years back or a few years back, pandemic, COVID. That was one event which we couldn't have predicted, but we all knew that if it comes, there will be a major disaster. The effect would be very deep and intense, and probabilities of mitigating that could have been done in some capacity, but we didn't envision, and we took it very lightly. So black events are similar to that. They are rare, unexpected. They're extreme and wide-ranging. They can be rationalized after the fact. But at the end of the day, they are unpredictable. What are green swan solutions? So this term, green swan, was originally introduced in 2020 around the same time when the pandemic was going on. It was with Bank of International Settlement, BIS, introduced this term in a negative way. They said that green swans are climate black swans. But in reality, fast forward that into a few months and a year and a half, industry started exploring different ways and bringing positive connotation to that. And what they said is, green swan could be green or climate black swan, but if you try to convert them, transform them into solutions, then green swan solutions could be something differentiating that can make impact. And that is what we are going to be focusing on today, which are more around green swan solutions. And what are those? They are transformative solutions. They can bring global change. They are the systematic change to the society, to the nature, to the world, to the earth, to bring positive future. And that is something we will talk about. So today's session is all about black swan events and green swan solutions. So with that, let me start with first question. And this is where we'll talk about how do you differentiate, or how do you go about looking at the event and then going back to the solutions. And often these green swan solutions, they take us to where we should be going. In contrast, black swan would present us with the events where we do not want to go. And the question I want to start with, in what way financial services institutions you feel that they are seeing these black swan events in form of climate crisis, and then how do we, or what can we do as a solutions, which are green swan solutions? So Sapna, let's start with that question, and then let's hear your perspective.
So, if you really look at from the financial sector perspective, right now, since we're talking financials, let's look at the numbers. There's a need for there's a 60 trillion in assets that need to be managed with a sustainability lens. That needs about 7 trillion in investment year over year from now through 2030 to be able to meet the net zero goals of the Paris Accord by 2050, right? How much is being invested today is about 1.7 trillion. While we are short of 7 trillion, there is an increase of about 13% year over year to get to that 1.7 trillion number. So it's a pretty huge investment. And in order to make that number, the financial institutions, they are really pledging in some serious amount of money, and they are really evolving their business strategies. So how are they evolving the business strategies? Let's just double click on it, right? There are 3 different areas that the financial institutions are very closely looking at. Number 1 is their own operations as to what is the emission which is generated from, let's say, our own data centers, our own corporate travel, etc. And then that is the number which is, while it is small, it's easy to manage and get under control. And many of the institutions have really gotten it under control. The second big chunk is the financed emissions, and which is a huge part of the emissions which get generated as part of the various financing that is done by these financial institutions to the corporate clients or the investment banking clients in the form of loans. So it's important to understand if as a financial institution I am lending to my corporate clients, how is that investment being used? Are my clients in line with the goals of the Paris Accord, as an institution is? And we need to look at it sector by sector. And there are various sectors across the board, with power, energy probably leading the chart, but then you have the commercial real estate, you have residential real estate, you have metals, cement, you have aviation, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And each one comes with its own nuances. So being able to identify the emissions from the investments made by these financial institutions across different sectors, and then being able to gauge for each of the clients what are their pipeline goals? What are their plans to get to net zero? Do they have plans or not? So the clients are being classified into the 3 categories, which is the clients which are aligned to the Paris Accord. They have a plan, that's great. Then the classification number 2 is the clients who have a plan, but they don't know how to get there. And that's where these institutions are devising what we call the client transition frameworks, which is they're really helping and hand-holding these clients to be able to get to that net zero bank, which in essence help the financial institutes meet their own net zero goals. And the third type of clients are the ones who are not aligned principally, and hence they don't have a goal. And that's where some of the hard decisions are being taken, whether to continue with those clients or not, right? So that's how the financed emission aspect is being looked at, which is literally the biggest chunk of the emissions from the financing that these big institutions are doing to their clients. And then the third area, which is also picking up traction big time, is what we call the sustainable financing, where the financial institutions are really investing their own money into some sustainable products, for example, like social bonds or green mortgages, or really funding the tech startups, the clean tech startups. So that is really picking up traction. So these are the 3 areas which are broadly looked at. But in addition to that, to make a dent in this space, we need to really adopt and put that climate lens on every process that is executed front to back, what we call the BAU processes, like business as usual. So for example, I'm leading the stress testing platforms, and what we run is what we call IST, which is the internal stress testing. But now, in the last couple of years, we have introduced something called CIST, which is climate internal stress testing, which means we are truly uplifting our models, and we are making sure that we are able to run those models with a climate lens on, with various climate macroeconomic variables, and being able to run the sensitivity analysis of the back of it. Similarly, on the climate risk space, we are, and many other institutions as well, have enabled climate risk as another principal risk in the enterprise risk management frameworks. So these are some of the core business processes that are being evolved, the business strategies being evolved, very targeted vision is being devised to be able to set the goal, have a targeted plan to achieve that goal, and measure against those goals.
It makes perfect sense. I think the way you talked about the shift in the business model and then creating strategies, I see that 2 of our organizations are quite aligned. Barclays is seeing sustainability, not just checking the box and doing things. And you guys have done amazing things in the sustainability space. You see that as future. You see that as a newer way of doing things. And at Capgemini also, we do the same way. We feel the same way. And that has integrated sustainability into everything we do. So absolutely, that's a way of looking at your world in your way. You talked about interesting topics around finance emission as well as risk management. And at the same time, you talked about growth. So looking at all 3 angles. Obviously, for banks or a large financial services institutions, when you look at decarbonization, I feel that the focus starts there, but then it needs to quickly shift into how you can being proactively manage the risk, at the same time getting into the growth part. So absolutely, that's where you need data, that's where you need analytics, that's where you need things to be more predictable and prescriptive. And with that, what comes in mind is regulations. What comes in mind is frameworks out there. What comes in mind is, the alphabet soup of, last I checked, there were 800 frameworks and regulations combined in the ESG and sustainability space globally. Every other day, you hear a new jargon out there. We are all talking about TNFD last year and this year, and now, 6 months down the line, there will be something else around it. So the question to you is, do you see these regulations and framework both helpful or hurtful?
I would say it's both. It depends on how you really look at it, the context and the implementation. So regulatory space is a complex one. And it becomes even more complex with ESG in place, right? So let's look at the positive side. The regulations are definitely helpful because they provide that, what we call the common language, right? It provides that common framework, the standardization, and a way to be able to be transparent. It can drive a positive change if it is enabled in a simplistic way. It can really enable the accountability. So if you look at some of the regulations which are popping up in Europe, for example, the likes of EU taxonomy, which is part of the CRR Pillar 3 regulation, or the likes of CSRD or CSDDs, these are providing some really good frameworks which help and guide the large institutions to be able to gear their direction towards a low carbon economy, and then also sort of guide them as to how to meet those goals. The problem comes in when these regulations are extremely complex and complicated, which is very difficult to interpret, very difficult to understand. And one of the areas where many institutions are lacking is also the SME knowledge in this space, because it's a pretty niche scale, it's pretty new, and it's very hard to interpret the regulation. And if the regulation is not easy to understand, then you are literally leaving it to the interpretation of the consumer. So the interpretation of these regulations could be difficult. The other area which is sort of problematic is that the regulations are non-uniform across the globe, which means that they are not same in one region versus other. And many institutions which are have international operations, they find it quite difficult to meet the regulation in one region and then to be able to meet the regulation in another region, because in some instances they're contradictory. So that adds to the complication. And when something is not achievable, then it becomes difficult to abide to those regulations as well. Let alone we're going to touch upon the data, which is problematic in this space as to, okay, now I understand my regulation, how am I going to get the data that I need? That's another big challenge. So I think that achievability is a big challenge. This can sometimes lead to greenwashing, where the companies can start fudging the numbers for the PR purposes, et cetera. So in a nutshell, I think regulations are really helpful if they're simple, achievable, if it's not overly governed. It can really drive a positive change. But if the regulations are complex, they're complicated, and they're overly governed, then it can really choke the system. It can impede progress. It can really hinder in the innovation.
I totally agree. So to summarize, what you're talking about is helpful on one end to get us on a common language, rather than across the geos and sectors and different places, people reporting on a different standards. Having a standard, a regulation, enforces everyone to be speaking common language. But on the contrary, also having too many of anything is not good. So that's hurtful if we have to report on A, B, and C, and each one of them have their own language of speaking. Also, data is new. It's a new paradigm we are living into. And that's where we run into similar challenges about having too many, which is hurtful in a case, or having overlapping standards and regulations is also hurtful. And I think the example you took was different geos having different regulations. Some geos are lagging, but still they may report on a different thing. And you look at CSRD, it's on top of everyone's mind right now. And you look at ESRS, that has close to 1,1178 attributes or different KPIs you need to report on. So you go through the whole analysis of what is material to you, and that is subjective. So there are complexities and there are challenges associated with it. And my next question to you is, when you navigate through these challenges with regulation or reporting or anything you need to do to report on a regulation, what are the obvious challenges? What are the top challenges? And how do you navigate through those?
Okay, I think the biggest challenge is the data in all of it, right? So I think I touched upon two things. One is the regulation itself, and the interpretation of the regulation is a big challenge, which is, let's say, even if we understand the regulation, translating those regulations into the data that is required is a big challenge, is that general know-how is not there. And once we understand the data that is needed, where to get the data from? So the data is, first of all, there is a lot of data out there which is available in the cloud in the form of texts and news articles, etc. But there is no reliable source of the information that can be used for, let's say, any regulatory submission, or even for your own purposes to be able to meet your own net zero goals as an institution. The data, the quality of the data is not available. The breadth and the depth of the information that is required is not available. And even if the data is available, it is not complete and accurate. So for example, if you look at the example of EU taxonomy, there were 6 or 7 templates that needs to be filled out. And we as an institution are supposed to know for our clients what are their percentage expense and revenue that goes towards climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, towards marine life prevention, towards pollution reduction, towards renewables. That's a lot of information. Where do I get that information from? So we tap into some of the standard available sources out there, the likes of CDP, which are really doing a great job, by the way, the climate disclosure projects, or the likes of GRI, which provides a great source. But in many other instances where the data is not readily available, you try to source it from various external sources to realize, first of all, it is incomplete. And second, even if it's not incomplete, the numbers don't reconcile to the public disclosures of the particular client that they have really publicly disclosed and are in public domain. So the quality of the data and the availability of the data is the big challenge. The second biggest challenge is in terms of being able to take that information and marry it to your finance internal data, and to be able to marry it to the risk data that you have. Because at the end of the day, you need to have that data, cleanse it, massage it, transform it, enrich it, and then being able to transform it into a template that needs to be submitted to the regulators. This whole journey, left to right, is pretty cumbersome. It's not easy for a number of reasons, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges that I can think of.
No, makes sense. I think the way you talked about bringing it back to it starts from interpretation of your data, or a rule, regulation, and then driving all the way into collecting that data, measuring that data, and bringing it back to the full cycle into reporting. Yeah, it's a big challenge, which, it's the journey. Everything is new around the space, so it's difficult. And, that brings me to the same topic again. We were talking yesterday about, we both lived through one of the black events of financial services, which was, 2008 financial crisis. We all could envision that something like could happen, but we didn't realize until that happened. And that was, in reality, the black swan event happened in 2008, which pretty much shook the whole world. And then if you look at in the rearview mirror, now we can rationalize, we can see that what can be done around it. And then came, a lot of liquidity analysis and stress testing and a bunch of other stuff are being done around it. With respect to climate crisis, the similar is being done by, pretty much all the global central banks. It started with ECB, and Barclays, was part of the initial list of 25. In Bank of England, when they did, in 2020, they did the first round of stress testing or climate scenario analysis. Then last year, 6 of the largest banks in the US, they did the similar work, which is the Federal Reserve asking 6 of the top banks to do the climate scenario analysis. And now, if you come to think of it, and that is another challenge, I'm just adding to what you're saying is understanding and envisioning and creating hypotheses around these climate scenarios and the effect of those climate scenarios, and writing models and training those models would be another challenge we would run into. Like if the global temperature hits 4 degrees above, the industrial age, what would happen to the portfolio, bank's portfolio? What would happen to, mortgage portfolio or residential mortgage or commercial mortgage? And some of those are the challenges out there. We don't know how we are going to solve them, but coming back to, green swan solutions. So I was walking around the floor. I was looking at all the events, the sessions at AWS reInvent 2024. Pretty much 80 to 90% of them had some flavor of generative AI. They talked about AI or Gen AI and data. And that brings me to the next question. How do you harness power of data and then augment it with generative AI to solve some of the challenges, just you talked about, I even talked about? How would you go about dealing with them? And can we use Gen AI in an effective way to solve that?
Yeah, I think we have pretty much established that data is the backbone of any process. It's the core foundational element, right? But data is only as good as the analytics that we can drive from it. We have to draw the inferences from it so that we can take that data from an information state to the knowledge, and then we can use that knowledge to be able to make wise decisions for the institution. And that's where I think Gen AI, if it is used wisely and within the guardrails, can be a really powerful tool. So let me touch upon the two spectrums of what we have touched so far. We have looked at the regulations. and the problems in the interpretation of the regulations, that's where the GenAI can be a really powerful tool, which is it can help you interpret those regulations into the data elements, and it can provide you the lineage back to what is publicly available in the public domain to be able to meet that regulation down to the actual elements of what is needed. And this is one of the things that is on our radar to do the POC on internally. If you look at the other spectrum of, we have been talking about the data is not available in a state that it can be consumed. But there is a ton of information out there which is unstructured, right? Which is in the form of, like it said, news articles. It could be in the form of videos, the blobs. It's out there. So that's where, and there's tons and tons and thousands of documentation with thousands and thousands of pages which is available in public domain, whether it is something which is submitted by different institutions from their public offerings, or in terms of their goals to meet the net zero sort of targets, etc. But that information is it's not humanly possible to be able to extract or drive inferences from that information. And that's where, again, I think the Gen AI, some of the LLMs which are out there can be really powerful to be able to take that information and summarize it in the form that can be then consumed easily or humanly. And that's one of the areas that we are also looking at internally, is how we can use. So we are looking at some of the LLMs like the Claude Sonnet models available through Amazon Bedrock to be able to see how we can summarize that information. And we can literally devise some dashboards off the back of it. These could be competitive dashboards, this could be comparative dashboards. And we can enable some chatbots that can really enable some of our data scientists or some of our sustainable SMEs within the bank to be able to communicate with that data more effectively. And that's one of the journey that we have kicked off, and we are hopeful to make some progress in that relatively soon. There are various other, I think, if not Gen AI, some of the native ML AI capabilities which can be really powerful to do the predictive modeling. So for example, you touched upon some of the stress testing models, which are more like predictive models, that you can predict the future in terms of the forward-looking impact of climate change on different sectors, and how does that impact based on a certain macroeconomic variables, and you can literally bump up and down those MEVs to be able to see the impact of that. So the ML and AI can really be powerful there. You can enable the AI to help with the climate risk mitigations, to help with the understanding of the limit monitoring within your space, or to understand the climate risk appetites. So I can literally see, especially within the financial institution, there are a lot of use cases that can be really powerful, but I'm going to still underline one thing, which is it should be used with caution, with proper guardrails, and within the boundaries of compliance and controls.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Gen AI is always about guardrail, and how do you ensure that you put what not to do first before even you start talking about what to do about it. So while that goes on, let's jump into what's out there, forward-thinking approach. When we talk about generative AI, we talk about green technology, green tech. We talk about innovation. We talk about what's out there that can help drive this efficiently, effectively, and in a more sustainable way. And identifying examples of both technologies and techniques is important. And I think my question to you is, when you are going through these, looking at technologies, looking at techniques, when we walk on the floor, at least the expo hall, we saw that there are several examples they've created. Even AWS has created a few proof of concepts, and they were talking about, how can you make use of Gen AI for KYC, or how can you make use of Gen AI to help a loan mortgage initiator, make it a simple interactive bot out of that, or intelligent assistant or administrator about that. So identify examples when you look at the techniques and technologies. What comes to your mind, and how can we think forward-looking way?
So I think there are various techniques which have really picked up traction. I think many of the folks in this room are probably aware of, right? So if you look at from the renewables perspective, of course, the solar, the wind, the hydro are becoming extremely popular. But at the same time, I was reading the other day the article on SMRs, which is small modular reactors, which are even gaining further traction because they're portable and they are available year-round, unlike some of the others, like solar and hydro. So that's really becoming popular. For eco-friendly transportation, I see a lot of Teslas around, right? So definitely the EV vehicles are becoming growingly popular. They are easily affordable and accessible. And there are various other motor vehicle companies which are now coming up with their own EV solutions or EV cars, et cetera. So that's really gaining traction. It's becoming affordable at the same time. I think one other interesting area is this sort of sustainable agriculture, which is more in line with precision farming and your what we call the vertical farming, where it's amazing to see some of the stats, how some of these techniques are able to yield 300 times more produce than your conventional agriculture, yet taking only about 97% less water and land. So that's pretty impressive. And then talking of Gen AI, I think some of the very precision irrigation mechanisms to be able to preserve and conserve water is becoming popular. And we talk about the clean tech startups. So I think I was just attending a session yesterday in I think Venetian, I guess, where the AWS is really funding some of the really cutting edge clean tech startups. Now these are, and they're really helping them in three areas: standing up the infrastructure, being able to help grow their business, and being able to procure funding. So I think there are some of those clean tech startups are growingly becoming popular. And we talk about circular economy. So I was also looking somewhere in the sustainability showcase the other day on the circular villa. It was pretty impressive how the whole setup was done and how you can power like your local library through another institution right there in the city. So I think similarly in the one more area which I can think of is in the building space. There are some clean tech startups. So there is this company called AirX, for example, which is gaining traction to be able to generate these clean bricks. It's called air bricks, which are replacing your traditional bricks to be able to build homes, especially in UK. So it's reducing your power consumption at the same time providing you cleaner air. So it's a win-win. So I think a lot of these tech startups are popping up, and many of the big institutions, including the financial sector, is really supporting them through either through their innovation wings or through their sustainable financing. They're really pumping and pledging some serious money into sustainable financing in some of these tech startups to the extent of trillions of dollars.
Yeah. I think the way we went through the wave of startups, they evolved into many types, and green tech being one of the biggest one right now. We're seeing examples. If you think about forward-thinking approach, you're absolutely right about precision agriculture. Regenerative agriculture are one example. On the other end, recently I was reading about this OTEC, which is, I think, ocean thermal energy conversion, and what they're looking at doing, and this is some of very forward-looking thing where what they're talking about is the surface temperature of oceans and the deep sea temperature, leveraging those two and convert that into energy. They're talking about and these are in the concept stages, and they are creating proof of concept where literally you can have green roads in terms of, you can leverage roads to fuel your cars, or you can have parking lots with all the solar panels and then having them, fuel your cars. And on the other hand, you're talking about financial services. As a capital allocator for all of the, world's economy, we have a bigger role to play to, fund these, put money, and I know Barclays is doing that, Capgemini is doing our part, but this is the opportunity for us to at least elevate the discussions to the next level, bring those proof of concept to the next level, and having, fueling that towards this forward-thinking approach. And when all of that is going on, I think the important part is, together, collectiveness, we need to do it together rather than, one person, one corporation, one entity doing by itself. I think it's a collective togetherness is another approach we have to take. And with that, I'm going to get to, summarizing everything or, bringing everything together.
Just to add to your point on collectiveness, I think that's really the need of the hour, right? Is how do we collectively solve for the data problems, the likes of CDP and GRIs, and especially from the financial institution perspective, there are various other alliances that have been stood up like GFANS, which is your Glasgow Financial financial analytics or analysis for the net zero, as well as the likes of PCAF, which is the new accounting principles for the carbon. And it literally provides that framework for the large institutions, especially on the financial side, to be able to, first of all, understand and report your emissions from the lending portfolios, from your investments, et cetera. So it's like industry coming together and being able to solve for this collectively. I think it is the need of the hour.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we need to understand that, this problem is real, which is what, we have established. We talked about it, that, this black swan event, which is the climate crisis, is something we have to deal with. It's something real. It's something we are observing everywhere, and we need to be prepared with that. And then coming to it, to address that, what you need to know is understand the importance of data, because it's a new paradigm. It's something we have to start with, we have to understand, and then blend that with power of technology, power of AI, power of generative AI. So part one is understanding importance of data, understanding how AI and Gen AI and others can empower or augment that. But at the same time, we need to think about transition. And I know you talked about Barclays is looking at this like 3 pillars, the way you always talked about. And the third pillar is always client transition. Moving ourselves as a bank is one thing, but taking all our customers with us is important. And that is how all of us should be thinking. And it needs to be a communal approach rather than one corporation, one entity, one person, one country doing it. It needs to be a communal approach. We definitely keep in mind profit with purpose, because we are in an industry which is, capitalism is important. And just doing it for sustainability, doing it for future is absolutely there, but without profit and without purpose, not combining them, it's not going to work. And then the final thing I think, I would say, and I'll let you also bring your perspective, but the way I see and the way we try to integrate sustainability at Capgemini is think sustainability as how you used to think 15 years back about digital. At that point, it started as a digital. We need to have digital transformation for your customer communication, digital transformation for your products and services. But now, nobody talks digital in silo. Digital is part of everything we do. And that's how sustainability needs to be. Sustainability needs to be way of life. We need to be doing things by having sustainability as a core, by having way of working. And this is where, I want to end and, ask you, what's your perspective? How do you see, what are the key takeaways at least you want audience to take out of this?
I think just like you mentioned, a few years back, digitization was a thing and now it's not anymore. I think sustainability should be part of your DNA as you go along, right? And when it comes to, and the institutions and whatever you do in terms of whether it is your client transition framework, it's important to understand how you embed that climate lens in pretty much everything that you do. That's something that has to be done to be able to make a difference. So we talk about, if you really look at the climate change, it is to the same magnitude as the Industrial Revolution, which took about 200 years. And we are trying to make an impact and move to a low carbon economy and meet the net zero in line with the Paris Accord by 2050, which is like 25 years. So it's a pretty humongous task, right? And unless we have that targeted focus, we have a dedicated plan and we measure ourselves against that plan and we have that vision to be able to get there, I don't think we're going to get there collectively. And like you rightfully said, it has to be a communal approach where we all come together and we work together towards achieving that goal collectively. I think it's going to be the need of the hour. It's, again, how you work on your own within your institution, but also how you're hand-holding your clients to be able to meet that goal is going to be absolutely important.
Yeah. And again, going back, I think sustainability is, not only a goal, it's a journey, and we all have to do it together. With that, I'm going to open up for questions if there are any questions. Would love to interact rather than just two of us talking. We wanted to make it more interactive. If there are questions, would love to answer.
I think that's probably a wrap.
All right, that's a wrap. Thank you very much.
Thank you.